The 1920s. Band-Aids, frozen food, and TVs were made in the 1920s. Many other important things happened along with these cool new inventions, such as Prohibition, the Jazz Age, immigration, and the stock market crash. These events no doubt made this the most important decade. To describe the 1920s, Paul J. Getty said, "The Roaring Twenties were the period of that great American prosperity which was built on shaky foundations." These new inventions covered a variety of life's areas. For the house, there were radios, washing machines, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, and toasters. In clothing, there was more variety, the flapper style, and bathing suits. In food, there was more restaurant eating, packaged foods, delicatessen shops, candy and sugar, and quick lunches. There were also motor cars, more golf, moving and talking pictures, nightclubs, traveling, children's toys, more smoking, magazines and tabloids, jazz, comic strips, and parks and playgrounds. The most changing of these inventions were the Band-Aid, frozen food, electronic TVs, penicillin, the traffic signal, the radio station, liquid-fueled rocket, and the bread slicing machine. These inventions changed how Americans lived by putting an emphasis on making things easier and faster for the people. According to Bill Bryson, the 1920s was a great time for reading altogether, very possibly the peak decade for reading in American life. Soon it would be overtaken by the passive distraction of radio, but for the moment reading remained the people's principal method for filling idle time. The new inventions of the time surely took over people's leisurely time, therefore making a huge impact in their lives until this present day. These cool inventions are part of why the 1920s were the most important decade, because these inventions are still used and appreciated today. Prohibition had started way before the 1920s. It had first started when Maine passed the first prohibition law in 1846. After this, other states did the same thing by the time the Civil War began in 1861. The main reason why this started was because women saw alcohol as a destructive force in families and marriages. In 1917, President Woodrow Wilson instituted a wartime prohibition in order to save grain after the First World War. In that same year, Congress submitted the 18th Amendment that banned the manufacture, transportation, and sale of intoxicating liquors. In October 1919, Congress passed the National Prohibition Act that provided the guidelines for the enforcement of the prohibition. People who wanted to still drink liquor would go to illegal stores or nightclubs that were called speakeasies, while some went into the business of bootlegging or the legal making and selling of liquor. This encouraged the rise of criminal activity. The most notorious example of this was the Chicago gangster Al Capone, who earned $60 million annually from bootleg operations and speakeasies. Support for prohibition was ending by the end of the 1920s. In February 1933, Congress adopted a resolution proposing a 21st Amendment to the Constitution that would repeal the 18th. According to Bill Bryson, there had never been a more advantageous time to be a criminal in America than during the 13 years of Prohibition. At a stroke, the American government closed down the fifth largest industry in the United States, alcohol production, and just handed it to criminals, a pretty remarkable thing to do. Prohibition affected this time greatly, as well as today, by becoming a part of the amendments and how it is now over, so liquor is not prohibited anymore. The 1920s is also called the Jazz Age. Jazz first emerged in the early 1900s in New Orleans. The Jazz Age was characterized by young people throwing parties, drinking illegal liquor, and dancing new dances at jazz clubs. One of the symbols of this time was the flapper. The flapper look was short bobbed hair, knee-length fringe skirts, long necklaces, and stockings. F. Scott Fitzgerald said this about the Jazz Age. Though the Jazz Age continued, it became less and less an affair of youth. The sequel was like a children's party taken over by the elders. The Jazz Age has contributed greatly to music in the modern era that we live in, which is why this decade is the most important. Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong made jazz popular, and Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith made blues popular. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 25 million foreigners arrived to America. The Immigration Act of 1924 limited the number of immigrants allowed entry into the United States through a national origins quota. The quota provided immigration visas to 2% of the total number of people of each nationality in the United States as of the 1890 national census. It completely excluded immigrants from Asia. President Herbert Hoover said this about immigrants. These men of many nations must be taught American ways, the English language, and the right way to live. Another migrant movement was the Great Migration. This was a mass movement of African Americans out of the rural South and into the urban North. African Americans built their own ethnic communities like New York's Harlem that became the center of African American cultural life in the United States. This became known as the Harlem Renaissance. Immigrants in America have greatly affected American life then and now because of diversity. During the 1920s, the U.S. stock market went up rapidly and reached its peak in 1929. People were buying stocks on margin or borrowing money from banks to buy stocks. Many people tried to get their money back from the banks, only to find out that the banks couldn't collect the money that they lent to the people who bought stocks on margin, and that the bank used the people's money to buy stocks themselves. Hundreds of banks failed, and people lost everything they had. The stock market crash was one of the reasons of the Great Depression. Ron Chernow says this about the stock market crash. After 1929, so many people had been traumatized by the stock market crash that there was a lost generation. The stock market crash had a major effect on American life and the generations that followed. The 1920s had many things happen in it. The new inventions, prohibition, the jazz age, immigration, and the stock market crash all have lasting effects until this day. This is the reason that the 1920s is the most important decade. These inventions are still in use today. Prohibition taught valuable lessons to Americans. The jazz age introduced the independent woman in jazz. Immigration is embedded to the country, and the stock market crash caused the Great Depression. The 1920s was a spectacular and changing time.